Well, Tom, welcome to Winchester.
Thank you.
May I introduce Tom Holland, distinguished author, all-conquering podcaster, champion cricketer, and all-round lovely man. Should we introduce the third person on stage, who is Suetonius himself? That seems like a good person to start with. Tom, would you be so good as to sketch out who he was? When he lived, life and times, a bit of background.
As you say, I'm thrilled for the lad that he's been invited to a literature festival in Winchester 2,000 years after he died. It's absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for coming to hear about him. So Suetonius lived at the end of the 1st century AD and the beginning of the 2nd century AD. So kind of pretty much the period that most people would think of as being the heyday of the Pax Romana. And he belonged to a kind of literary set that included Pliny the Younger, who is the guy who wrote 2 letters describing the eruption of Vesuvius. So if you have ever read anything about Pompeii, you would have come across his letters. And he was a very distinguished senator, much kind of higher ranking than Suetonius, and acted as a patron for Suetonius, kind of finding him placements in the imperial household where Suetonius worked as an archivist, and then he ends up becoming personal secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. And for about 5 years, Suetonius is essentially the conduit through which people who want to have contact with Hadrian has to go through. So he handles all the kind of the correspondence. And Hadrian is a very conscientious, active emperor. So there's a lot of work going on. And of course, Hadrian is also famously, everyone in Britain knows that he comes here and commissions his wall. This is because Hadrian is always on the move. He's endlessly touring the provinces, particularly the frontiers of the various provinces. And wherever Caesar is, that is where the center of government is. And so Suetonius has to accompany him. And Suetonius he travels with Hadrian, and he travels with Hadrian's wife Sabina, and he travels with the head of the Praetorian Guard, who, after Pliny the Younger's death, has become Suetonius's patron. Huge, the imperial household. They go to Germany, and then they come here to Britain. And this is the visit in which Hadrian says, okay, we're going to build a wall here. But the other thing that happens more germanely from Suetonius' point of view is that he gets caught up in a massive sex scandal with Hadrian's wife. And we don't know we just know there was a sex scandal. We don't really know anything more than that. But what we can say is that it was sufficiently bad that it saw both Suetonius and the head of the Praetorian Guard dismissed from their posts. But it wasn't so bad that the 2 men got executed. So we presume that from this point on, Suetonius retires to his villa and continues with his writing. So just to talk about his writing, he's best known for the lives of the Caesars, 12 biographies that run from Julius Caesar up to the Emperor Domitian, who dies just before the beginning of the 2nd century AD. But he also writes all kinds of books on other topics. So he writes a book, The Lives of the Caesars. He also writes one on lives of the most famous prostitutes. He writes one on public entertainments, so gladiatorial shows and chariot races and such like. He writes about fashion. He writes about childhood. He writes about basically everything. And I think he's fascinated in the way that culture, so clothing, sex, food, all kinds of things like that, what they tell us about how society functions. And you see this, it's very evident in his lives. He's interested in all this kind of stuff. It's what makes the biographies so fascinating. And most of these, we only have tiny fragments of his other works. But clearly he's a very voluminous writer, and he's voraciously interested in all kinds of things. Specifically on the lives of the Caesars, because he has access to the imperial archives, because he's familiar with the Palatine, which is the kind of where the emperor has made his base, the hill in Rome, He can go and look at letters written by Augustus or by Claudius or whatever, put them in his book. It's incredible. There you have them. But I suspect that once he has been cut off by Hadrian, dismissed from office, he gets his library pass confiscated as well. And it's telling that the later biographies are less detailed than the earlier ones and tend not to have letters being quoted in quite the same way. So I guess the equivalent would be a writer having access to the internet cut off, and you would probably notice that there would be a diminution in the range and quality, perhaps, of the biographies. But we don't know when he dies. But essentially, he's a man who is. He's not a mover and shaker in the imperial household, but he is close up. He knows how emperors operate. And I suspect that being close up to emperors means that he's perhaps readier to see them as fallible human beings to a degree that perhaps he wouldn't be had he not had that sense of intimacy with Hadrian.
Right. I'm very interested in talking a bit about some of the individual lives in a bit, but I wonder if I could ask you first about the origin of the project, because you've mostly written history books, Rubicon, Persian Fire, a couple of decades ago, more recently, Dynasty, then Pax, bringing the story of Roman history right up to the period that we're talking about here. This is your second translation after the one of Herodotus, also for Penguin Classics. How does a project like this begin? Do you get approached by Penguin and said, would you like to do this? Or have you pitched the idea? You said, this is my favorite author, Suetonius. Please let me translate it. How
so
does it work?
I translated Herodotus, and as you will know, Herodotus' Histories, which is a sweeping account of the Persian Wars, but also much more broadly of the world as it existed in the 5th century BC, as seen by an insatiably curious Greek. It's the longest work of prose in ancient Greek. And I loved Herodotus, but I thought I really don't want to translate something as long as that again.
Yes.
It's the brutal fact. And so I was asked by the editor of Penguin Classics, was there another text that I would like to do?
Oh, really?
And I thought, well, it would be nice to do one that isn't as long as Herodotus. But also I thought it would be good to do a Roman text. And because I'd written about Julius Caesar in Rubicon,
right.
I'd written about the house of Augustus, so that's Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero in Dynasty. And then I was in the process of writing Pax, which covers the year of the 4 emperors, so that's AD 69, when after Nero's death and 4 emperors fight for control of the empire. And one of them wins, this guy called Vespasian, who then has 2 sons, and this completes the 12 Caesars. So I thought I would like to do Suetonius. And as ever, when you do a translation, it's like a kind of marriage. You know, you hope it's going to work out well. You like the author, you enjoy time together, you've candlelit dinners, that kind of thing. But you never know really until you've bedded down with each other. And I don't like Suetonius as much as Herodotus, but he's fun.
Yes.
I wouldn't want him to write my biography.
Oh, yes, that was a good question.
I think anything, if you really were in a marriage with him, he'd just talk about all your foibles, and you wouldn't be able to hide anything. It would be all around Rome. But he's hugely entertaining, and I think that he opens curtains not just on the individual emperors, but on the way that the Romans thought about life more broadly. Because as I say, he's interested in things like childhood or what the kind of food that an emperor likes. I mean, it tells you a lot about an emperor, but it also tells you a lot about Roman attitudes to food, or sex, or clothing, or whatever. So he's a very, very interested and interesting man. And I was really happy to have the chance to live very intimately with him for a long period of time. Yeah,
so I'm interested, you used him a lot as a source, presumably, when you were writing, to some extent, Rubicon, but particularly Dynasty and Pax. And And then, so that would have been one kind of relationship with him, mining him for information.
Yeah.
And now you're translating him. Is that a total transition? Are there things that you learnt from the translation process that would actually have changed the way you'd have written those history books?
I don't think so. I mean, so the big question is, the stories in Suetonius are often very, very salacious. So anybody who's watched I, Claudius or read I, Claudius will be familiar with some of the, I mean, I say racy, I mean, some of the details are unbelievably shocking and horrible and have blackened the names of emperors for all time. So Caligula and Nero, obviously, but I think most egregiously Tiberius, who I think suffers very badly and unfairly at Suetonius' hands. And so the question is always, to what extent can we rely on Suetonius' account? I mean, to what extent does it tell us anything about the individual emperors? What it does tell us about is how the emperors were seen and understood. But I think, to reiterate, I think being up close with an author like Suetonius opens up my eyes to more broadly how the Romans understood aspects of their culture and their society. And again, what I've always felt, and I feel it more completely having done Suetonius, having written 3 books of Roman history, is that things that you might be tempted to assume are kind of fundamental to human nature. So sex, I think, is the most obvious example, but attitudes to kind of morals or ethics or whatever that we might be tempted to assume are universal are not at all. And that the Roman take on these things is radically different to ours. They absolutely have very strict moral standards, but they're not our moral standards. And the things that shock Suetonius about the depravities that his emperors supposedly get up to, I think are not necessarily the things that shock us. And there's a disconnect there that I think is completely fascinating and which was absolutely sharpened for me by translating him.
Right. This idea of cultural contingency is one we talk a lot about in Dominion. We're talking about the history of Christianity, so there's an interesting link there. Can I ask one other question about the translation process before we move on to some of the lives? And that is, I remember hearing you speak about your approach to translating Herodotus, and you had a very interesting strategy, if memory serves, which is you translated 1 chapter of Herodotus a day, regardless of the length. And a chapter of Herodotus is not like a chapter of a modern novel. It could be 5 lines, but it could be 3 pages. It could be 5 pages or something like that. Yeah. Did you adopt this process this time, and it served you well?
I did. So every day I would have to do a little bit of it. I do it because again, the lives are broken up into kind of chapters, some of which are very short and some of which are quite long. And I did do that. And the result is that when I reread it, I can remember exactly where I was when I was doing it. And it's sharpened by the fact that I began translating it in the autumn of 2019 and carried through to the summer of 2020. And of course, that is when the lockdown intervened. Yes. And I remember I went to the Jaipur Literature Festival and booked myself into this incredible kind of palace hotel outside Jaipur, which was like Gormenghast. It was this vast kind of complex of tunnels and stairways and things. Amazing. And I translated the life of Caligula there, looking out over the Indian plains. And it felt absolutely, I felt like I was in a Roman villa or something doing it. And then I came back to Britain, and there was the sense that the lockdown was approaching. And then the final half I spent translating it in the lockdown. And the weather then, of course, was beautiful. And my 2 daughters, you taught one of my daughters, they were doing Latin translations as well, because one of them was at school, one of them was at university doing it. So the 3 of us were all sat there, and it was like we were in some kind of monastery or something, not allowed to go out, doing our translation. And so, because of the strangeness the strangeness of that time, again, is so vivid when I read it, reread the translation. It's so kind of present in my mind. It's like kind of photographic imprint on my brain.
Wonderful. So perhaps that has affected which is your favourite of these lives then, because you've got these 12 lives which are quite distinct in feel, or maybe break up into groups. And I was interested when you made a podcast series about it, you had the introductory episode which roamed very widely, but perhaps particularly focused on Augustus and Nero, on whom you'd already done an episode. And then you gave individual episodes to Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius. But at several points there and in the introduction of the book, you indicated that the life of Augustus was your number one. You thought it was a level above some of the others in terms of its sophistication.
Yes.
What makes that life so...
Well, so Augustus, I think, is the central figure in Roman history. I think he's the most talented political figure in the whole of Western history. He's an absolutely titanic figure, and it's evident that Suetonius gets that. So Augustus is the man who... Rome had been a republic. It's torn to pieces in a series of violent civil wars. The central protagonist in the first of these civil wars is Julius Caesar. Augustus is Julius Caesar's adopted son, his actual great nephew, and his genius is, first of all, to win the civil wars and to emerge the sole political supremo in Rome. And secondly, to establish an autocracy on the rubble of the Republic in such a way that the Romans, for whom the notion of monarchy is anathema, that they're happy to accept him. And all the subsequent Caesars rule, therefore, in Augustus's shadow. Augustus establishes the template of what it is to be an autocrat in a Roman context. And therefore, he entirely merits the longest biography in the collection, which is what Suetonius gives us. But also, it's the kind of pivot around which the rest of the lives revolve. So Augustus is the second biography. The first one is Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is situated in the world of a republican system. So it's a very radically different kind of life to read. But then when you get to Augustus, this is establishing the template for all the other ones that will follow. And it's the most detailed that you get. So I've already mentioned the letters that Augustus writes. I mean, it's incredible. Letters are written to his wife Livia, written to Tiberius, his ultimate heir. Really amazing to get them. But you also get all kinds of incredibly intimate details. And Suetonius' model of biography isn't one that I think we would recognize today. So it begins with Suetonius describing the ancestry of the Caesar that he's describing. So we have detailed accounts of Augustus's forebears. He goes into the question of whether Augustus's forebears are high-ranking, or whether, as Mark Antony, his great rival, suggests, that they're all terrible commoners, who get up to terrible things. Then you get details of how, from childhood through to old age, all the things that Augustus has done, some of which are terrible. Suetonius doesn't try and cover that. I mean, he describes how there's one guy who he gouges out the eyeballs with his fingers. Then he reports a story that Augustus sacrifices 120 senators on the Ides of March in honor of the slain Julius. But this is before Augustus has become Augustus. This is when he's kind of on the make, and he's incredibly brutal. You don't become ruler of the Roman Empire in a succession of civil wars without being incredibly brutal. But then once he's attained power, then he puts aside that kind of terrorist angle of him and rules as a prince of peace, and then ultimately the father of his family. And so this is also what we get from Suetonius' account. And then he plunges into all the stuff that people will remember. So the kind of clothing he liked to wear. He likes to wear a battered straw hat, like the man of the people that he is. His fondness for gladiatorial shows. He's a great populist. Caesar presents himself to the people in the box. He puts himself on public show. If the games don't measure up, then the people will let him know it. So even though he's an autocrat, to that extent, Augustus is always offering himself up to the people and seeking their validation. And he receives that validation. The people think he's great because his gladiatorial shows are absolutely, unprecedentedly sumptuous. Then we get kind of physical details. Augustus has blotches on his back. He has yellow teeth, which have kind of even spacing between them. These kind of details. We get accounts of his sex life. And there's a lot of sex in the lives of the Caesars. An enormous amount. Have to have quite a specialised Latin vocabulary to handle it. And it ends up providing what serves later generations as the model biography of a great ruler, and this outlasts the Roman Empire. So. A copy of Augustus's life is read by a guy called Einhard at the court of Charlemagne. And he then writes a life of Charlemagne that is modelled on the life of Augustus. And right the way through the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and into the Enlightenment, Augustus provides a model for what an emperor should be, eye gouging and all. And that's why I think that one of the reasons why Augustus and the Caesars more generally are so vivid in the popular imagining in a way that the Persian kings or the pharaohs of Egypt aren't, is that it's because of Suetonius. It's because he gives us warts and all. It's up close. It's kind of gossip magazine. It's telling you everything. So you know what they look like. You know how they behave. You know their foibles. Whereas, I don't know, Cyrus the Great or Ramesses the Great, they're names, but we don't know those kind of details. And so I think he really is important in making the Romans seem familiar to us in a way that other ancient civilizations aren't.
Yes. The biography which you said doesn't quite work in terms of building a coherent character is that of Tiberius, Augustus' successor, who I have always told pupils is my favourite emperor. You've got to have an answer to that. Oh, right.
He's mine too.
There we are.
He's great.
Explains it all. Yeah. But that's just the genuine answer. It's also a slightly contrarian position. And then when I was rereading the life in your translation and I got to all the stuff on Capri, I thought, oh no, what have I done? Because it's just horrendous, page after page of really, well, what I'd like to think is the black legend, the rumour mill at its darkest. How is it? There are lots of helpful explanatory notes, but in the end, as a reader, it's hard to tell fact from fiction unless you start pulling down all sorts of books from the archives, and then you discover we just don't know. What's your take on this life of Tiberius? Where did Suetonius go wrong if he went wrong, or is is something special going on?
So Suetonius' biographical technique, I think, is where he can to get primary sources, but he also relies on secondary sources, so biographies that have already been written about his various emperors. And Roman we think, say, commentary on the presidency of Donald Trump is polarized, and people are ready to believe the worst or to believe the best of a figure like Donald Trump. This is even greater in ancient Rome. Emperors are massively polarizing figures, and it's evident that Suetonius sometimes finds it difficult to square very positive and very negative perspectives. And in his biography of Tiberius, this is where it's most glaring, and it's by far the worst biography as a biography, because essentially he's taken a very positive take on Tiberius and a very negative one, and he's just jammed them together. So one minute you're reading about how brilliant Tiberius is, he's rushing off, he's saving the empire, he's a great military leader, he's an incredibly intelligent man, he's a very committed public servant, and the next time it's like he's on, what's his name, Epstein's Pervy Island, being an absolute, Prince Andrew figure, only worse. And it's shocking, and it doesn't really gel. And so Suetonius' explanation for this is that all along Tiberius had been a massive perv, but he kept it hidden.
Yes.
And then when he got to Capri, this island off the Bay of Naples, he could let it all out, and because there was no one there to watch him. And I emphasize that there was no one there to watch him. So essentially, Suetonius is reporting stuff that has clearly been made up. And there's a similar moment where he writes about Domitian, the last of the emperors in the 12 Caesars, where he has this report about how Domitian is such a horrible, evil man that his idea of fun is to sit alone in his study, stabbing flies with his pen, which is such an incredible detail that once you hear it, you never forget it. But again, he's sitting alone in his study. Yes. Where is this report coming from? So I think that the image of Tiberius he creates is terrible as a biography, but as an exercise in myth-making, it's extraordinary, because the idea of Tiberius as this aged, kind of vampiric, withered pervert on his island, getting up to truly unspeakable stuff. And I mean, it really is unspeakable. It's so vivid, and it's part of the kind of the glamour of sex and blood and cruelty and sadism that, again, makes imperial Rome kind of the setting for people's darkest fantasies that it always has been. But I think that it's very, very unfair. However, as a translator, I can only translate what's there.
Suetonius is Tiberius rather than...
Suetonius is Tiberius, yeah.
The dramatic man himself. So it sounds like one of the reasons he might be your favourite emperor is that you feel he's been maligned and you feel a duty to rehabilitate him. But what are the other reasons? And
I think so. Tiberius is from one of the great Republican dynasties, and in the Republic, these dynasties are they provide the men who serve as the consuls, who command the armies, and so on, and has done for centuries and centuries. And Tiberius is a Claudian. And the Claudians are the kind of the grandest, really, of all these families. So he feels that he is heir to that Republican tradition. And had there not been an autocracy, had Augustus not existed, if the Republic had kept going, Tiberius would have played, a tremendous role in it, as he does because he's Augustus' stepson. And it's obvious from his career that he's a man of incredible ability. So twice he saves Rome from the empire from imploding. There's a terrible war in what's now Hungary, where he stabilizes the frontier and crushes the what otherwise might have broken the pivot between the Balkans and Gaul. And then after the massacre of the 3 legions in Germany in Augustus's reign, again, it's Tiberius who stabilizes the frontier, and he does it with tremendous ability. And then as emperor, he's a man of incredible intelligence, and he's an excellent emperor, because there are no wars. The empire is completely at peace. And the perspective in Rome from high-ranking people who are feeding not just Suetonius but Tacitus, the greatest of Roman historians, who's also very, very vituperative about Tiberius, is clearly resentful of the fact that Tiberius is not maybe providing the elites with the opportunities to fight wars that in an ideal world that they would want. But the perspective from the provinces is, this is unbelievable. This is an age of peace like we can't imagine. And you have the perspective, say, of intellectuals in Alexandria who are also writing about Tiberius is, this guy is incredible. He's the most learned man we know. He has a kind of, his understanding of humanity's relationship to the divine and the supernatural and the gods is unprecedented. And he has given us peace, and the form of government that he has given is responsible. So under Tiberius, a broader stretch of territory knows peace and knows relatively decent government than any previous period in history. And I think that he's a remarkable figure. I mean, if I had to choose a period of Roman history to live under, I would choose the reign of Tiberius to live under. And yet, he's seen as this kind of hideous vampire. And I think it's really harsh. Whereas actually, if you look at the scattered accounts of what Augustus is doing in old age that aren't deriving from the more kind of pop bitch level of commentary, he likes a pub quiz. His idea of fun is to set quizzes for all his friends who are all kind of literary scholars. And he likes growing asparagus. He's a great man for a vegetable plot. I think he sounds great.
He's commendable.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. We were talking just before we came on about classics in popular culture, and this is a wonderful contribution to the life of classics in the UK in the 21st century. My view is that classics has never been more popular in the country, whether that's measured by the popularity of books about Greek mythology, CF Stephen Fry, or blockbuster films, and we've got Christopher Nolan's Odyssey and another Odyssey, The Return, in the cinemas now. Are you optimistic about classics and Roman history and the enthusiasm of...
I mean, I think that the fascination of Greece, and I think particularly Rome, I think Rome has a particular allure and appeal for people for reasons that we've touched on. But I think also particularly at the moment because the United States was modelled on the Roman Republic. And so ever famously, the Roman Republic falls and gets replaced by an autocracy. And so whenever you have moments where that process might seem to be going on, people suddenly start becoming interested in Roman politics, perhaps in a way that under normal circumstances they wouldn't. So I think there's all that. And I think also Rome, more than Greece, lends itself to spectacle. So I'm really interested to see how the Christopher Nolan film does this. I think Greece is much harder to bring to to Hollywood, because ancient Rome, particularly Imperial Rome, is about display and special effects and CGI and stuff. CGI seems entirely appropriate. The Caesars would have loved CGI.
Yes, absolutely.
They'd have been all over it. Whereas I suspect, I don't know, Sophocles would have been a little bit more reticent about it. But inherently, it's so interesting. It's so interesting. I mean, every generation is interested in it. So I have absolute confidence that people will complete, will always be interested in it. And actually, doing the podcast, we get the download figures. We can tell what periods of history people are most interested in. It's what you would expect. I mean, it's Nazis at number 1, Tudors at number 2, Romans at number 3. The Romans are, in historical terms, they're always massive box office. Slightly less confident about the future of the study of ancient languages, because particularly in state schools, the curriculum is so tight and the funding for it at the moment isn't there. So the government has cut off one of the funding avenues that was providing Latin for state schools. They have said publicly, they've affirmed their support for the study of ancient classical languages. And they say that they're going to back it, and I'm hopeful that they will. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, had actually, she studied Latin and entirely accepts its value. But whether I think it's really important that classics isn't just the preserve of wonderful private schools like Winchester, but that people who can't afford to go to private schools should also have the opportunity to do it. And I think that those opportunities have been diminished over the past year, but I hope that there will be opportunity. The plant hasn't been completely crushed, and I hope that there'll be opportunities to water and tender it over the next few years. But I think that the enthusiasm is for antiquity is there, and I know for a fact that means that there are people who want to, quite young children who want to study it. I mean, they tell me. I know that they do. I mean, obviously not everyone, but there is a kind of an enthusiasm, I think, for studying Latin that maybe for younger, for people at school now, that sense of Latin as, the sense of cold showers and, all that has gone.
Yes.
And it's associated now with video games and special effects
Yes.
in Hollywood films and so on.
Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if only the teaching can be found and the space in the school curriculum can be found, that bodes well. But those are big ifs.
Well, can I share the enthusiasm of some of my own pupils? I've got a prop here, because we were talking earlier about future projects for you as an author, but also as a podcaster. And I asked my pupils to come up with suggestions for some ancient history topics for podcasts in the future.
I'm all ears.
So are you ready for them? Some of the highlights you can tell me. And perhaps you're already planning some of these, and the audience can decide whether any of these are on the cards. So we have the Oracle of Delphi.
That's a good one. Yeah,
it's
on the possibility.
A 10-part series on Persian satraps, starting with Megabazus, which is their favourite name.
Megabazus. I would never get that past Dominic.
They did this in teams.
That's a genuine point. Obviously, we will do something on the Persians. We did an episode on the Persians very early on with Ali Ansari, where we basically said the Persians are responsible for everything.
Yes.
Gardens, postal services, suits. But the problem is the lack of written sources that enable you to tell a story.
Right.
This is the huge problem.
Comes back to Suetonius, yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, woke emperors.
Woke emperors. That's a
This
challenge.
is the youth of today. Okay. Best ancient names.
Yeah, I like that.
Colour in the ancient world. Status of purple. Loss of paint on temples. I thought that was quite interesting. They had about 2 minutes to come up with this. And equivalent wealth of ancient people. Was Crassus richer than Cyrus?
So we have thought about doing a series on the richest people in the world, and Crassus might be one of them. So that is a possibility. We have a series that will be coming up in about a couple of months on Hannibal, the rise of Hannibal. So elephants, Alps, Romans losing battles and being slaughtered in vast numbers. I think that's what the kids want, to be honest.
Yes.
Elephants and blood.
And I made one other list of 5, and you might recognize it. Roman spectacles and contests, Greek pastimes, Cicero's Republic, Roman and Greek abuse of words and their derivation, and correct names and form of clothes and sandals and other things that people wear.
Yeah, well...
Do you recognize that?
Yeah, my lad. My
Absolutely.
boy.
These are lost works of Suetonius.
But not the world's most famous prostitutes.
No, I left that one out, I'm afraid. The correct names of sandals reminded me of Kaiser Wilhelm II,
yes, and his
friend of the show.
I mean, so entertainment. I mean, gladiators are an absolute constant. Unfortunately, it will be a strain to get gladiators back on the show.
Right.
But that's exactly the kind of aspect of Rome that people are fascinated by, and Suetonius was fascinated by.
Brilliant. Well, we have plenty of time for questions now. Would anybody like to ask one? What I will do is sometimes just
Lady there?
choose one, and sometimes take a couple and put them to Tom, and there are roving mics.
What do the source materials look like? So, the actual physical materials that you're translating from?
Well, the problem is that unlike the Near East, where the source material consists of clay tablets that if you have a fire, they then get baked, and so they can survive for thousands and thousands of years to be dug up. We only have one physical library from classical antiquity, and that's the famous library that was found in the villa in Herculaneum. It's kind of very charred, and so it's been a constant challenge to work out, can you unroll it and read what's there without destroying the rolls. And I gather, for complicated scientific reasons that I don't really understand, that this is now possible. And so huge excitement. You know, what are we going to get? Are we going to get scabrous accounts of, you know, gossip from the age of Cicero or whatever? No, it's an Epicurean philosopher.
Philosophy, yeah.
Frankly, is quite boring.
All the way down.
And so we're just kind of hoping that there might be something slightly more exciting than that. And apologies to any Epicureans who may be in the audience. So we are entirely dependent for the sources and for the survival of Suetonius, for instance, on people copying it. And essentially that means with Latin literature, as opposed to Greek literature, you're dependent on monks in largely the Latin West, not exclusively, copying these texts and handing them down. And that means that there are always bottlenecks. And so there is a classic bottleneck with Suetonius. We know of two texts of Suetonius that were being read in the early Middle Ages. One of them is in Constantinople, where we get the detail that the captain of the head of the Praetorians, who got sacked by Hadrian for having supposedly had an affair with his wife, that he is the dedicatee of the lives of the Caesars. We know that from an encyclopedist who had read a copy of Suetonius in Constantinople and made a note of it in the 10th century. So presumably in 10th century Constantinople there was a complete copy of Suetonius's lives. We also know that that Einhard, this biographer of Charlemagne, in the 9th century in Aachen, that he has access to a copy of Suetonius, but and it's in the Latin West that we have this kind of thread that goes through into the broader Middle Ages, but the copy of Suetonius in the Latin West that gets copied is missing the opening section of the life of Julius Caesar. So we miss the dedication to Suetonius' patron, and we miss the details of Julius Caesar's ancestry. So you kind of go straight into the account of what he's up to as a young man. And then throughout the Middle Ages, Suetonius is widely copied. And so by the time you get to the printing press in the 15th century, there are lots of manuscripts that can be copied. But there are lots of examples of Latin texts that have survived in one edition. Tacitus is one, and we're missing lots of Tacitus. I mean, maybe that there are copies in some, in a jar in some monastery that's yet to be discovered. A kind of very detailed text by Cicero was discovered in the Vatican Library in the 19th century. Maybe there will be texts in the Herculaneum Library. The rubbish tips in Egypt are very profitable sources for fragments of Greek drama, of poetry. There was a poem by Sappho was found recently. Gospels are found there. Probably less likely to be Latin literature there. But we are dependent essentially on what the monks chose to copy. And, thank goodness that they did. Gentleman at the back?
Thank you. You mentioned that Suetonius goes into a lot of detail in his sources, giving us niche references. But how reliable do you think he is as an ancient historian, especially if we compare him to other authors, ancient historians of the time who write about emperors like Virgil, Velleius Paterculus, Strabo, Josephus?
I mean, he's not a historian. He's a biographer. So, and this is very clear. This became clear to me when I was translating it. A thing I hadn't noticed before is that if he's doing the biography of Augustus, he will introduce Augustus by name at the start of his biography, and then going all the way through, he barely uses Augustus's proper name, so that essentially you're forced to assume that every third person verb is Augustus. And it has a kind of monopolizing effect that the name of the emperor becomes a kind of absent center, like a kind of a lake into which every stream is draining. So the emperor becomes the center of everything that Suetonius is writing about. As I hope I've implied in what I was saying earlier, there's a lot in Suetonius that I think is exceedingly unreliable. If what you want is the precise documentary account of what emperors were actually like and doing. I think that there is a lot of hearsay, a lot of calumny. So with Caligula, for instance, which has, I think, my favourite line, not just in ancient biography, but any biography, he does a list of all the things that Caligula got up to that were kind of vaguely all right. And then he pivots and he says, but enough of Caligula the man, now for Caligula the monster. And he, for about 20 pages, it's all absolute filth. A lot of which you can kind of make sense of. Caligula had a very dark sense of humour, a very cruel sense of humour. So the famous thing that everyone knows about Caligula, that he made his horse a consul. Caligula never... Suetonius doesn't say that. Suetonius says that Caligula told senators that he could, if he wanted, make his horse a consul. And this is clearly a joke. It's a joke mocking the aspirations of senators who themselves want to become consuls. But in Suetonius' version, it's a sign that he's mad, that he's thinking about making his horse become a consul. So in that sense, the last laugh is on Caligula. But you also have the details that you get for the first time in Suetonius' life of Caligula, that he commits incest, that he's having an affair with his sisters. This is not mentioned before. You mentioned Josephus. Josephus gives quite a detailed account of Caligula's life, doesn't mention it. Seneca has every reason to hate Caligula. He doesn't mention it. These are all people who, had the stories been current that Caligula was committing incest, they would have mentioned it. So that suggests that Suetonius essentially is, this account is originating with himself. So I think you have to treat it with a lot of what he writes with kind of care. Having said that, where he can source material, he does. I've mentioned the letters that he quotes by Augustus. I mean, this is kind of very up close and personal. And he's very anxious to provide documentary evidence for where he has arguments with other biographers about details that he's confident about. He will provide his evidence. And so there's quite a moving one about he wants to press the case that Augustus had a particular name deriving from a place where he was supposed to have had particular associations. And he's arguing this against other biographers who deny that this was the case. And Suetonius says, I found this little bronze bust of Augustus, and it had this name Thurinus on the base. So this proves that Augustus must have had this name. It must have been one of the names by which he was known. And Suetonius then goes on to say, and I presented this bust, this little statuette, to Caesar, which means Hadrian, Suetonius' employer. And Hadrian, Suetonius tells us, then kept it in his kind of personal collection of household gods in his own private quarters. So there you have a kind of an up-close detail about Augustus. We know that these little statues were being made with this particular name on it. We know that Suetonius had gone out and looked for evidence and found it. And we know that Hadrian was kind of very moved by being given this statue by Suetonius and kept it in his personal quarters. And considering all this is going on, almost 2,000 years ago, there I think you do have an example of how the millennia can just melt away and you feel really up close to these people. So sometimes the focus is very precise. At other times it's absolutely shockingly unfair. But it's a bit like reading a newspaper. It's not so different. Certainly, it's like being on social media.
Tom, question about your method, I suppose. Other translations are available. They're even available in Penguin Classics. Many will have read them. Did you set out to do something different, to find some different aspects of the text you wanted to bring out? Or did you put everything else aside and just go with your instincts in the text?
So one of the reasons why, and it's very embarrassing to admit this, why I wanted to do Suetonius in particular, is that the previous translation in Penguin Classics was by Robert Graves. And so I read I, Claudius and Claudius the God when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12. And it was my introduction to the world of the Julio-Claudian court. And I then went and read Graves's translation, and it was the second Penguin classic after Herodotus that I'd read. So I have very fond memories of it. And then when I reread it prior to doing this, to thinking, should I do it? And I thought it was very bad, actually. So partly doing this is a homage to Graves. I mean, it's an incredible honor to be following in his footsteps. You know, he's an author I massively admire and respect, and he's been a huge influence on me and on kind of awakening my interest in ancient Rome. But also, I think his translation is really bad, and for two main reasons. The first is that he served in the First World War. And I think you see the imprint of that in the way he translates Roman military ranks, so centurions, tribunes, whatever. So centurions, I think, are called sergeant majors, and tribunes are called colonels. And it's very disconcerting to read Caligula summon the sergeant major of the praetorians. I mean, it might have been fine in the 50s, but I don't think it works now at all. And the second reason is, which is obviously why I enjoyed reading it so much when I was 12, but I still think is quite poor from a translator, is that whenever he came across a bit that he found boring, he just cut it. So, as I say, I quite respect that, but I don't think that's really what a translator should be doing. I think a translator should be, personally I feel, should be trying to give to a reader as close a sense of what the writer you're translating is about, what he's trying to express with what he's written as you possibly can. And that means finding forms of English that are as close as possible to the very different language that is Latin. But also trying to convey a sense of what it is like to read Suetonius in Latin, and that means not cutting out bits that you find boring. And also, I think, trying to convey a sense of, say, the sentence structure, because Suetonius' sentence structure is quite distinct. There are very lengthy sentences, and then there are very short staccato sentences. And these are obviously deliberate stylistic effects. And I think that if you just blur them out, then you're not being true to what Suetonius was doing. So that's kind of why I thought that it was ultimately not too disrespectful, I hope, to Robert Graves to have provided a new translation for Penguin Classics. Lady there in the reds.
Just in reference to your comment about Caligula being a human and then a monster, like pivoting between the two, I just wondered if you got a sense reading when you were reading and doing the translation of what the attitude was towards perhaps their quasi-human status. Like, were they genuinely considered? You mentioned the word divine before. You mentioned a connection to the gods. I'm not sure what the difference between those two would be, but yeah, just comments on that.
Yeah, so in one level, they are absolutely seen as human. They are citizens. Formally, Rome continues to be a republic. The pretense is that Caesar is a citizen and everyone else is a citizen. It's the mass of the Roman people, and this is really important. And in a sense, what you're tracing through the lives is the way in which this pretense becomes more and more unsustainable. So in the first life, the life of Julius Caesar, he is a citizen in a republic, and it's his attempt to establish his supremacy over the state that culminates in him being murdered. And I should just mention that Suetonius is excellent on people dying. He's really interested in that, and his account of the Ides of March is excellent. I mean, it's really very vivid and dramatic, and underlies a lot of the kind of the people's understanding of what happened on that day. And then we have Augustus, and Suetonius specifies that Augustus is appalled when someone addresses him as being a dominus, a lord, a master, and says, "Never use that word in reference to me. I'm absolutely not that," because an emperor doesn't want to seem like he's a dominus or still worse, a rex, a king. Because if you do that, then you're risking the fate of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March. But by the end of the period that he's covering with Domitian insists on being called Dominus. And so you do have that sense that that the emperor is becoming ever more overtly an autocrat. And Domitian ends up murdered. And the last section of the lives of the Caesars is Suetonius' description of the Senate celebrating his death by toppling his statues and defacing his inscriptions and essentially trying to obliterate his memory. So the pretensions of Suetonius to being to being a lord, a master, is even by the end of the lives is being regarded as something hideous. So in that sense, yes, the Caesars are portrayed as human beings. This is why we get all the details about, did they eat too much? What sexual deviances did they have? All this kind of thing. On the other hand, Augustus becomes a god. Julius Caesar becomes a god. Claudius becomes a god. Vespasian becomes a god. Their divine status is acknowledged in the headings that Suetonius gives his lives. So Divus Augustus, the deified Augustus. And that obviously has implications for the Caesars who share his bloodline. So that, I think, is why the lives of Augustus and Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius and Nero do have a particularly heightened and feverish quality to them, because there is a sense in which they are partaking in the divinity of Augustus. And particularly, I think, with Nero is making play with this in all that, notoriously he's a matricide. He doesn't try and hide it. He kind of promulgates it. And I think that's because heroes in Greek tragedy are matricides. And Nero is casting himself as someone who is midway between the mortal and the divine. And Suetonius is kind of aware of that. So again, it's a sense of a shifting of tone. At some points, Suetonius will describe emperors as, they've got bad breath, or, they urinate in a particular manner or whatever. And at other times, there's all kinds of mad stuff about portents coming from the gods and all kinds of things like that. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating, is it's not one tone. You see the Caesars up close, but also you get a sense of just how intimidating they are by virtue of being a Caesar. Got time for one more, do you think, or not?
Is there one more question? The gentleman there.
Very quickly, if you're Putin or you're Trump or you're Xi, and you've just read your book and you're thinking about burnishing your legacy for the future, any tips that I would take from that as to what I should be doing?
To publicise this, I did a feature in the Times where I imagine Suetonius was around to write the life of Donald Trump. And obviously I put in all the filthiest, unfairest, darkest stories about him. And this included the notorious episode, supposedly, of him being in the hotel in Moscow and having prostitutes urinate on him, which is supposedly the compromat that is being used by the Russians. I don't believe that happened for a minute, but Suetonius would definitely have put that in his life. So I put it in the life, and I had to be shown to the Times lawyers, and they came back and said, could you say that this is alleged and that it's not probably actually true and all this kind of thing. So I did what school books in the 19th century did with this kind of material and just put a load of asterisks.
Oh, wonderful.
Which actually I think worked much better, because I said, it was said of Trump that asterisk. So that's how but it made me think doing that, I couldn't have done that about Putin or even more about Xi, because there would be no Suetonius in the Kremlin or in Beijing. And I think it reflects well on America that all this kind of detail about Trump is still out there. So I think to that extent, he's not an autocrat in the way that Putin or Xi is. I mean, I think Trump is. I mean, he seems to have the hide of a rhinoceros. Don't think he hasn't come after me. That's all I'm saying.
Well, Tom, it has been an enormous pleasure to enthuse with you, the most enthusiastic of men, about the lad Suetonius. Copies available in the foyer. So thank you so much for your talk.